I was already interested in these areas. I had a very close friend who was a Persian Sufi Muslim who I used to speak with a lot, and she would always give me things to read whilst I was still at university, and that was the late 90s, early 2000s. And I knew already about the problems which she would describe. She, like a lot of other people in London, had an Iranian exile whose family had fled the Shah in '79. So I already knew a bit about what this meant in terms of followers of the faith of Islam. I knew about the bad guys. I knew about the Wahhabis. I knew about the Khomeinists. I knew people who had very strong views about all this, who were Muslim. Very few other people particularly cared. It seemed like an internal battle. I mean, after 9/11, of course, it became clear to people that this was perhaps a battle with larger repercussions. For me, actually, the things that were more alarming were the things I saw particularly in Holland, where I had a lot of friends, which was a kind of very worrying shutting down of the debate, really, on these things. Holland was quite a long way ahead. I say this in my book as a chart how from about 1990 onwards, Holland really went round a lot of the subjects we didn't start on until after 9/11. And I spent time there. I had a lot of friends there, philosophers, writers, artists, and they were very clearly already on a kind of front line. And it was, in Britain, we had one early warning siren of all of this, which was the Satanic Verses affair in 1989. I remember that very clearly, and was horrified like everyone else was, and was pleased as everyone else was when we heard that the Ayatollah had died. It was we felt it. We felt this was an ugly intrusion onto our rights. But then in Holland in the early 2000s, I saw this was actually becoming, as it were, rampant. There was the murder of Pim Fortuyn, prominent liberal, gay, left-wing politician who wasn't described as a right-wing maniac until he started talking about Islam. And then his assassination, of course, in 2002, and then the assassination of Theo van Gogh 2 years later in 2004. And I suppose I must have met and become friendly with Ayaan around that time, maybe a bit later. And these seemed to me to be early warning signs that there was a problem. And I also listened to those sirens that went off. Ayaan was one. Bruce Bauer, American expat, gay author in the Netherlands, was another. Oriana Fallaci, the anti-fascist Italian journalist, an interviewer, novelist, was another. These sort of noises went off across Europe saying, watch out, there's a problem. And they came from a really fascinatingly diverse array of people. And that was sort of, I listened to those early warning sirens. And I also listened to and was worried by the prevalence of the desire to shut them down. I remember when Ayaan got into this terrible situation in Holland after Van Gogh was killed, and the Dutch authorities really went for her. And I wrote in the Dutch media at the time, this was a sign of something we'd already seen glimmers of, which was that, or glimpses of rather, which was that there were people shouting fire, and people decided that those people were the fire starters, and it was clear to me that they were the firefighters. They were the people trying to identify this, trying to warn people. But every single country in Europe, and to a certain extent in America, the people who did the watch out, there's a fire thing, were treated like arsonists. And when their society got rid of them in whatever way, that society behaved as if that might solve the problem. It's a very, very bad early sign, and something we're still suffering for now. So that was really how I got interested in it. And it's, it's the most interesting subject of our time in a way. I mean, we're all a bit bored of it now, of course. And as Sam and I have often said, I mean, the opportunity cost, one thinks of the books one might have written if had to spend so much time on this. On the other hand, it's the most interesting thing of our time because a massive theological intrusion has occurred into all of our countries, which some people seem not to mind. Or they would mind if it came from, the evangelical churches, but they sort of don't think they ought to express the fact they mind, even if they do, when it comes from Islam. And that is interesting. And I think that in some ways is even more interesting than the Islam bit, is the bit of, well, why would we be so vulnerable to all of this cultural, push and the encroachment of religion into people's lives again by a different route? Why would we be so vulnerable to that? That, in some ways, is an even more interesting thing